Black Janitor discovers Orphaned Otters. Overnight sanctuary formed. Water splashed violently across the concrete floor as Harold Jenkins frantically tried to block the rising flood with sandbags. The maintenance closet light flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows through the basement of the Riverside Community Center. At 67, his back protested every heavy lift, but the desperate squeaking sounds coming from the cardboard box on the shelf drove him forward. "Hold on, little ones," Harold gasped, his weathered hands trembling as he reached for the box. Inside, 3 baby otters huddled together, their tiny bodies wet and shivering. The basement was filling with water fast the storm drain had backed up and the river was overflowing its banks. The radio crackled with emergency alerts. "All residents near the Riverside area are advised to evacuate immediately. Repeat, this is not a drill." Harold's phone rang. It was Diana Peterson, the wealthy community center board president. "Jenkins, are you still in the building? You need to get out now." Diana's voice was sharp with panic. "The riverbank is collapsing. Ms. Peterson, I found something in the basement. Baby otters. They'll drown if I leave them," Harold said, his voice steady despite the water now reaching his ankles. "Otters, for heaven's sake, Jenkins, leave them. That's an order. The structure isn't safe." Harold looked at the frightened creatures, then at the rising water. "I'm sorry, Ms. Peterson, I can't do that." A tremendous crack sounded as part of the ceiling gave way. Water gushed in faster now. Harold clutched the box to his chest and looked desperately for an escape route as the lights went out completely. "Jenkins, Jenkins!" Diana's voice came through the phone before the line went dead. "But let's go back to how this all started." It was just 3 hours earlier when Harold Jenkins arrived for his evening shift at the Riverside Community Center. Harold Jenkins adjusted his faded blue uniform as he parked his 1976 Chevy Nova in the staff lot of the Riverside Community Center. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns that stretched down to the river's edge. At 67, Harold had been the night janitor here for nearly 15 years, ever since the steel mill closed and he needed to supplement his reduced pension. As he gathered his things, the radio announcer on WRKB mentioned possible storms later that night. "And don't forget, folks, today marks 40 years since the Great Flood of 1983, which devastated our community. A special ceremony will be held tomorrow at the Memorial Park." Harold turned off the radio, memories of that terrible flood washing over him. He had lost his first home to those waters. Shaking off the thought, he grabbed his lunch pail, the same one he'd carried to the mill for 30 years, and headed inside. The community center was a hub of activity, as usual. A retirement planning seminar was wrapping up in the main hall, while a children's dance class practiced in the East Wing. Harold nodded politely to the parents waiting on benches, scrolling through their phones. None looked up. That was fine by him. Harold preferred to work quietly, unnoticed. "Mr. Jenkins," a warm voice called out. It was Linda Martinez, the center's program coordinator, a kind woman in her 50s who always made a point to greet him by name. "How are you this evening?" "Just fine, Ms. Martinez. Storm coming, though." Linda frowned, looking out the windows at the perfectly clear sky. "Really, it's beautiful out." "My knees say different," Harold said with a slight smile. "Never been wrong yet." "Well, I hope they're wrong tonight. The Peterson Foundation is hosting a big fundraising dinner here. Diana Peterson herself is attending." Harold nodded, knowing all too well who Diana Peterson was. The 65-year-old widow had inherited her husband's real estate empire and now ran the foundation that owned the community center. She rarely visited, but when she did, everything had to be perfect. "I'll make sure everything shines," Harold promised, heading to the maintenance room to clock in. The evening progressed normally. Harold mopped floors, emptied trash bins, and replaced light bulbs in the hallway. Around 7 o'clock, volunteers began setting up for the fundraising dinner in the main hall. Crystal glasses, expensive china, and elaborate flower arrangements transformed the usually modest space into something elegant. Harold was polishing the brass handrails on the grand staircase when Diana Peterson arrived with her entourage. She was dressed impeccably in a designer suit, her silver hair styled perfectly, diamond earrings catching the light as she moved. "The centerpieces need to be higher," she instructed a nervous-looking young man, "and check that the temperature stays at exactly 72 degrees. Her gaze swept across the room and landed briefly on Harold. Her expression didn't change as she looked through him, continuing her conversation. Harold was used to being invisible. He continued his work methodically, moving to the windows to make sure they were spotless for the evening's event. Outside, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, just as his knees had predicted. The river, usually calm this time of year, seemed higher than normal. Harold frowned, remembering the forecast and the anniversary of the flood. Something didn't feel right. By 8 o'clock, the fundraiser was in full swing. Men in expensive suits and women in cocktail dresses mingled in the main hall, champagne flowing freely as they discussed donation amounts. Harold worked his way to the basement to check on the storage areas, as he always did during his shift. The first drops of rain began to hit the small basement windows as he made his rounds. Within minutes, it had turned into a downpour. Harold could hear the rain hammering on the roof even from the basement. He checked the sump pump. It was working, but the water was coming in faster than usual. Then he heard it, a strange, high-pitched squeaking sound coming from near the back door that led to the riverbank. Harold followed the noise, flashlight in hand. In a soggy cardboard box pushed up against the door, 3 tiny river otters huddled together, wet and frightened. They couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, eyes barely open, making distressed noises as they sought warmth from each other. "I'll be," Harold whispered, kneeling down despite his aching joints. "Where's your mama?" The baby otters squeaked in response, their little paws reaching out. Harold carefully shined his light around, looking for an adult otter, but found none. The rising water must have separated them from their mother. Just then, his radio crackled. "Jenkins, come in." It was Linda Martinez, her voice tense. "Jenkins here," he responded, eyes still on the otters. "The weather service just issued a flash flood warning. The storm's much worse than expected. The river's rising fast, and they're concerned about the dam upstream. Ms. Peterson wants to know if we should cancel the event." Harold looked at the water already seeping under the door. "I'd say that's wise, Ms. Martinez. The basement's already taking on water. I'll let her know you should come upstairs." Harold looked at the baby otters. He couldn't just leave them here to drown. Carefully, he picked up the box. "I'm bringing something with me. These little fellas need help." Upstairs, the elegant fundraiser had transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. Guests were gathering their belongings, staff were covering the food and equipment, and Diana Peterson was on her phone, looking irritated at the interruption to her event. "Linda, call the catering company. We'll reschedule for next week at the country club instead," Diana was saying as Harold emerged from the basement, the box of otters in his arms. Linda noticed him first. "Mr. Jenkins, what do you have there?" Harold set the box down carefully on a table cleared of champagne glasses. "Found them by the back door. River otters, babies, no mother in sight." The 3 tiny creatures had huddled into a ball, their wet fur matted together, eyes wide with fear. A few of the departing guests gathered around, expressions softening at the sight. "Aren't they adorable?" one woman in an expensive dress commented. Diana Peterson approached, her face showing no such softening. "What is the meaning of this, Jenkins? This is a formal fundraiser, not a wildlife rescue." "The river's rising, Ms. Peterson," Harold explained calmly. "These little ones were abandoned. They'll drown if we leave them." Diana looked at the otters with distaste. "Call animal control or the wildlife department. This isn't our concern." Harold stood straighter, meeting her gaze directly. "It's after hours. By the time anyone gets here, it might be too late." "That's hardly our problem. We need to secure the building and leave." Diana turned to address the remaining guests. "Everyone, please proceed to your vehicles. We'll be in touch about rescheduling." As people moved toward the exit, the rain intensified. Through the windows, lightning flashed, illuminating the swollen river. The wind howled, bending the trees along the riverbank. Linda's phone rang. After a brief conversation, her face paled. "That was the emergency management office. The old dam is showing signs of stress. They're asking everyone within a half-mile of the river to evacuate immediately." Diana's composed facade cracked slightly. "Very well. Jenkins, lock up after everyone's gone. Make sure all the electronics are unplugged and the valuable items are secured upstairs." Harold nodded, but his eyes went to the box of otters. "What about them?" "As I said, not our concern." Diana gathered her designer purse and coat. "I have a foundation to protect. Millions in charitable work is more important than wildlife." As Diana and the last guests hurried out to their cars, only Harold, Linda, and the otters remained in the building. Linda approached the box, gently stroking one of the baby otters with her finger. "They're so young. What will you do with them, Mr. Jenkins?" Harold thought for a moment. "My sister Mabel volunteered at a wildlife center years back, taught me a thing or two about caring for wild animals. I could take them home, keep them safe until the storm passes, then call wildlife rescue in the morning." "Do you have what you need to care for them overnight?" Linda asked, concern evident in her voice. Harold hesitated. "Not really. They need special milk formula warmth, a safe container." Linda made a quick decision. "The kitchen has whole milk, not ideal but better than nothing for one night, and there are towels in the supply closet." She hurried off to gather supplies. The storm outside intensified. The lights flickered once, twice, then stabilized. Harold's radio crackled with an emergency broadcast. "Attention all Riverside residents. The National Weather Service has issued a severe flood warning. The dam upstream is under significant pressure. Residents in low-lying areas should evacuate immediately." Linda returned with an armful of supplies. Towels, a plastic container with air holes punched in the lid, a small heating pad from the first aid room, and a baby bottle from the daycare center filled with warmed milk. "This should help for tonight," she said, helping Harold transfer the otters to the drier, warmer container. "I need to go. My grandson is home alone. Will you be okay?" Harold nodded. "Go on. I'll finish securing things here and take these little ones home. Just need to check the basement one more time to make sure that pump is working." "Be careful, Mr. Jenkins," Linda said, squeezing his arm before hurrying out into the storm. Harold carefully settled the otters in their makeshift home, making sure they were warm and dry. He tried offering them some milk from the bottle, and to his surprise, they eagerly accepted it, their tiny paws grabbing at the rubber nipple. "Hungry little things, aren't you?" he said softly, a smile creasing his weathered face. It had been a long time since he'd cared for another living being. Not since his wife, Eleanor, passed 5 years ago. After feeding the otters, Harold made his way back to the basement to check on the water situation. What he found alarmed him. Water was now flowing in steadily under the door, and the sump pump was struggling to keep up. The radio continued to broadcast warnings, each one more urgent than the last. Harold was about to head back upstairs when he heard a tremendous crack from outside. Through the small basement window, he saw a section of the riverbank collapse, sending water surging toward the building with greater force. The maintenance closet light flickered overhead as Harold frantically tried to block the rising flood with sandbags stored for emergencies. Water splashed violently across the concrete floor. At 67, his back protested every heavy lift, but the thought of the baby otters upstairs drove him forward. He needed to get back to them, get them out of the building before things got worse. As the water rose around his ankles, Harold abandoned the sandbags and hurried to the stairs, only to find water cascading down from a leak in the ceiling. The structural integrity of the old building was compromised. Harold waded through the rising water to reach his radio. "Emergency services." "This is Harold Jenkins at the Riverside Community Center. Building's flooding fast. Need assistance." Static was his only answer. The storm must have knocked out communications. He made his way upstairs, moving as quickly as his arthritic knees would allow. The otters were where he'd left them, still dry in their container, but clearly distressed by the sounds of the storm and the creaking building. "It's okay, little ones," Harold soothed, gathering their container. "We're getting out of here." Just as he reached the main entrance, his phone rang. It was Diana Peterson. "Jenkins, are you still in the building? You need to get out now." Diana's voice was sharp with panic. "The riverbank is collapsing." "Ms. Peterson, I've got the baby otters. We're heading out now," Harold said, his voice steady despite the water now seeping under the main doors. "Otters, for heaven's sake, Jenkins, leave them. That's an order. The structure isn't safe." Harold looked at the frightened creatures, then at the rising water outside the glass doors. "I'm sorry, Ms. Peterson, I can't do that." A tremendous crack sounded as part of the ceiling in the main hall gave way. Water gushed in faster now. Harold clutched the container to his chest and looked desperately for an escape route as the lights went out completely. "Jenkins, Jenkins!" Diana's voice came through the phone before the line went dead. Now back to where we started. In the darkness of the flooding community center, Harold held the otters close. The main entrance was blocked by debris from the partially collapsed ceiling. The building groaned around him, more water pouring in by the second. "This way," Harold muttered to himself, remembering the service exit on the east side. He waded through knee-deep water, using his flashlight to navigate through the darkness. The otters squeaked in distress, sensing the danger. "SHH, it's okay," Harold soothed, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring the otters or himself. The service door was jammed. Harold set down the otter container on a high shelf and pushed against the door with his shoulder once, twice, 3 times before it finally gave way. Outside, the world had transformed into a raging torrent. The once beautiful grounds were now a lake, the river having completely overflowed its banks. Harold picked up the otters and stepped outside, immediately feeling the force of the wind and rain. His old truck was parked on higher ground, but reaching it meant traversing the flooded lawn. He secured the container lid and began the difficult journey, each step a challenge in the deep water and mud. Halfway to his truck, headlights cut through the darkness. A large SUV was making its way carefully along the flooded access road. It stopped, and to Harold's surprise, Diana Peterson emerged, wearing rain boots and a practical raincoat over her expensive clothes. "Jenkins," she called out, holding onto the SUV door against the wind. "Thank God you're alive. The fire department is on its way, but all their resources are stretched thin with rescues downtown." Harold struggled toward her, the otter container held high above the water. "Ms. Peterson, what are you doing here?" Diana waded a few steps toward him, revealing a strength and determination at odds with her earlier dismissive attitude. "I couldn't just. After I hung up, I realized. Oh, never mind that now. Give me those creatures and let's get you to safety." Harold handed her the otters and accepted her help to reach the SUV. Inside, the vehicle was warm and dry, the leather seats a stark contrast to the chaos outside. "You came back for me," Harold said, still processing this unexpected turn of events as Diana carefully placed the otter container on the back seat. Diana started the engine, her usual composure momentarily fractured. "I came back because no one should be left behind in a disaster, not people, not animals." She paused, then added more quietly, "I learned that lesson too late once before." As they drove carefully through the floodwaters, Diana explained. "My husband and I were in New Orleans during Katrina. Robert wanted to stay and help our neighbors evacuate. I insisted we leave immediately to protect our assets." Her knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "He went back in for the Thompsons next door. The building collapsed. I've spent 20 years trying to make up for leaving him behind." Harold looked at this woman he'd judged as cold and uncaring in a new light. "I'm sorry about your husband." "So am I." Diana glanced at the otters in the rearview mirror. "Those little ones, they reminded me. Robert always had a soft spot for wildlife. He would have done exactly what you did." They drove in silence for a few minutes, the wipers working frantically against the downpour. Harold checked on the otters, who were huddled together but seemed to be doing okay. "Where to?" Diana finally asked. "Your home," Harold shook his head. "My apartment doesn't allow pets." "And it's in the valley, probably flooding too." Diana made a quick decision. "My estate is on high ground, plenty of room. You'll both stay there until this passes." Before Harold could respond, the radio interrupted with an emergency broadcast. "The Riverside Dam has partially failed. Repeat, the Riverside Dam has partially failed. All residents in the following areas must evacuate immediately." Diana's estate was everything Harold had imagined: sprawling, elegant, and safe from the flooding due to its location on one of the highest points in the county. As they entered through the imposing gates, Harold felt distinctly out of place in his soaked janitor uniform, carrying a container of baby otters. The housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, a no-nonsense woman in her 70s, didn't bat an eye when Diana explained the situation. "I'll prepare the garden room for Mr. Jenkins and find something suitable for the wildlife." Within an hour, Harold found himself in dry, borrowed clothes, belonging to Diana's late husband, she'd explained, sitting in a sunroom overlooking the rain-lashed gardens. The otters had been settled in a large basin with warm towels, and a local veterinarian, a friend of Diana's, had been consulted by phone about their immediate care. "Goat's milk is better than cow's milk," Diana explained, entering the room with a small bowl. "Fortunately, Mrs. Winters has some powdered form for her digestive issues. The vet says it's closer to what they need until we can get proper formula tomorrow." Harold accepted the bowl, surprised at this practical knowledge from a woman who earlier had wanted nothing to do with the animals. "Thank you. They're probably hungry again." Diana sat across from him, watching as he carefully fed the smallest otter with a dropper provided by Mrs. Winters. "You've done this before," Harold nodded. "My sister Mabel rehabilitated wildlife for years. I helped sometimes, especially after Eleanor, my wife, passed, gave me something to focus on besides the empty house." "How long were you married?" Diana asked. 42 years, Harold replied, his voice softening. "Met at a Temptations concert in '69. She loved Motown music." Diana smiled faintly. "Robert and I were married 35 years. Sometimes I still expect to hear him coming through the door calling my name." A moment of understanding passed between them, two people who had experienced the particular loneliness that comes from losing a life partner. The smallest otter finished eating and curled up in Harold's palm, falling asleep. Harold gently placed it back with its siblings. "They're so trusting," Diana observed, "even after everything they've been through." "Animals often are," Harold replied. "More than people sometimes." Diana studied him with new interest. "How long have you worked at the community center, Mr. Jenkins?" "Harold, please, and it's been 15 years. Took the job after the mill closed in 2008. Needed to supplement my pension." "You worked at the steel mill, Riverfront Steel?" Harold nodded. 32 years, started right after Vietnam, was a foreman when they shut down." Diana's expression changed. My husband's company owned that mill. An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Harold remembered all too well the Peterson name on his final paycheck, the corporate decision that had upended hundreds of lives in their community. Robert fought against the closure, Diana said finally. The board overruled him, said it wasn't profitable enough anymore. She looked out at the rain. After he died, I found all his notes, plans to modernize the mill, retrain workers, keep it viable. Too late by then. Harold wasn't sure what to say. The mill's closure had been a bitter pill, but it was ancient history now. Water under the bridge, he said finally, the phrase taking on new meaning with the flood raging outside. Diana's phone rang, breaking the moment. After a brief conversation, her face grew serious. That was emergency services. The community center's east wing has collapsed. If you'd stayed. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Those otters saved my life, Harold said, looking at the sleeping creatures. Perhaps you saved each other, Diana replied thoughtfully. Throughout the night, Harold and Diana took turns caring for the otters, feeding them every few hours as the storm continued to rage. They really talked in a way neither had expected. About their spouses, their lives, the changing town around them. Harold shared stories of the mill in its heyday, when manufacturing was the proud backbone of America. Diana spoke of her foundation's work, her efforts to create opportunities in a community that had lost its economic engine. By dawn, the rain had stopped, though reports indicated the flooding would take days to recede. The sunroom was bathed in golden morning light as Harold dozed in an armchair, one hand resting protectively near the otter's basin. Diana entered quietly, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. Harold, she said gently, waking him. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center called back. They can take the otters this afternoon when the road's clear. Harold accepted the coffee gratefully. That's good news, though he felt a surprising reluctance at the thought of parting with the little creatures who had upended his routine life. Diana seemed to sense his hesitation. They also mentioned they're desperately short-staffed after the flood. Apparently, many of their volunteers can't reach the facility. Harold looked up from his coffee. They need help. They do. Diana sat across from him. And it occurs to me that the community center will be closed for repairs for quite some time. I suppose I'm temporarily out of a job then, Harold said, the reality of the situation sinking in. Or, Diana said carefully, you could consider a different position, one that might better utilize your experience with wildlife. Harold raised an eyebrow. What are you suggesting, Ms. Peterson? Diana, please. She set down her coffee. I'm suggesting that the Peterson Foundation fund a new wildlife rehabilitation annex at the center once it's rebuilt, and that you might consider overseeing it. Harold stared at her in surprise. Me? I'm a janitor. You're a man who risked his life to save 3 orphaned otters, Diana corrected him. A man with experience in wildlife rehabilitation, a man who knows more about our community and its needs than I ever bothered to learn. The smallest otter squeaked, drawing their attention. It was awake, looking around with curious eyes that seemed much brighter than the night before. Look at that, Harold said softly. Little fighter's doing better. Diana watched as Harold gently stroked the otter's head with one finger. They all are, thanks to you. She paused, then continued more decisively. The community center needs to be more than just a place for fundraisers and yoga classes. It should truly serve the community, all of it, including the wildlife that shares our Riverside. That's a big change of heart, Harold observed. Diana looked out at the flooded landscape visible beyond the estate's boundaries. Sometimes it takes a disaster to wash away old perspectives. She turned back to him. What do you say? Would you help me build something worthwhile from this catastrophe? Harold considered the offer, looking at the otters who had changed the course of his predictable life in just one night. I'd need to learn more about proper wildlife rehabilitation, get certified. The foundation will cover any necessary training, Diana assured him. And I'd want Linda Martinez involved. She has good ideas about community programs. Diana nodded. Absolutely, I should have been listening to her input long ago. Harold fell silent, thinking. At 67, he'd assumed his life's path was set. Retirement had seemed like a slow winding down, a gradual fading away. But now an unexpected door had opened, a purpose that connected to things he cared about. I think Eleanor would have liked this idea, he said finally. She always said I was happiest when helping Mabel with her rescue animals. Is that a yes? Diana asked, a hint of her businesslike directness returning. Harold smiled, the first genuine smile Diana had seen from him. Yes, but I have conditions. Name them. The facility needs to be accessible to everyone, not just wildlife rehabilitation, but education. School groups, seniors, everyone. Diana nodded. Agreed. And we hire local people who need work, train them like Mabel trained me. The foundation will fund it, Diana confirmed. Harold had one more condition. And these three, he said, gesturing to the otters, when they're rehabilitated, they get released right back in our river, with a proper protected habitat created for them. Diana extended her hand. Mr. Jenkins, you have a deal. As they shook hands, the morning sun broke fully through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the room. The baby otters, now more active, played with each other in their makeshift home, unaware that they had been the catalyst for something much larger than themselves. 3 months later, Harold stood at the podium on the grounds of what would soon be the Riverside Wildlife Rehabilitation and Education Center. Where once the community center's east wing had stood, architectural plans showed a modern facility designed to care for injured and orphaned wildlife while educating the public about conservation. Behind him sat Diana Peterson, alongside Linda Martinez, who had been promoted to co-director of community programs. In the front row were Mrs. Winters from Diana's estate, who had become an enthusiastic volunteer, and Mabel, Harold's sister, who had come out of retirement to help train the first group of rehabilitation specialists. Last night's storm wasn't just a disaster, Harold began, his voice steady as he addressed the gathered crowd and news cameras. It was a reminder that we're all connected humans and animals, wealthy and working class, young and old. When the waters rose, those distinctions washed away. He gestured to the river, now back within its banks, flowing peacefully in the summer sun. This river has been the lifeblood of our community for generations. It's given us so much transportation, industry, recreation. Now it's time for us to give back. At a signal from Harold, Diana joined him at the podium. Together, they unveiled a plaque that would stand at the entrance to the new center. The Robert and Eleanor Memorial Wildlife Sanctuary, because no one should be left behind. The crowd applauded as Harold and Diana stepped away from the podium to where a specially designed enclosure had been set up. Inside, 3 young otters, noticeably larger than the tiny creatures from that stormy night, played in a miniature riverbank habitat. They've grown so much, Diana remarked, watching the otters with genuine affection. Almost ready for release, Harold agreed. The biologists say the river's fish population is healthy enough to support them now. And the protected cove we've created should keep them safe from future floods, Diana added. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, a school bus arrived, delivering a group of excited elementary school students, the first official visitors to the future Wildlife Center. Harold and Diana greeted them together, an unlikely pair united by a shared purpose. Mr. Jenkins, a young girl asked, peering at the otters, is it true you saved them during the big flood? Harold smiled. We saved each other, actually. Sometimes the things we rescue end up rescuing us right back. Diana nodded in agreement, remembering how a night of crisis had washed away years of isolation and purposeless philanthropy, replacing it with genuine connection and meaningful work. As the children gathered around the otter enclosure, oohing and awing at the playful creatures, Harold and Diana exchanged a look of quiet understanding. The floodwaters had receded, but what they had revealed, a new path forward, a community united, and an unexpected friendship would remain long after the physical damage was repaired. In the warm afternoon sun, one of the otters swam to the edge of the enclosure, regarding Harold with bright, curious eyes, the same smallest otter that had once fit in the palm of his hand. Soon it would return to the wild, but the ripple effects of that stormy night would continue to spread through the community for years to come. If you're enjoying this story, Harold said to the gathered children, echoing the words he'd been using in the educational programs, remember that you're part of it too. Every one of us can make a difference in protecting the world we share. Diana smiled at the familiar phrase, one that had become something of a motto for their new venture. What had begun with a janitor and 3 orphaned otters had transformed into a mission that was healing more than just wildlife. It was healing a community, bridging divides of class and experience, and proving that sometimes the most unexpected connections are the ones that save us. As the sun began to set over the river, painting the water in shades of gold and amber, Harold Jenkins, no longer just a janitor, but a man with renewed purpose, watched the otters play and felt a deep sense of contentment. Life had taken an unexpected turn that stormy night, washing away the routine and familiar, but what had emerged in its place was something far more precious. A second chance, not just for 3 orphaned otters, but for everyone whose lives they had touched. Thank you for listening to our story, Harold said softly to himself as he prepared to close up the temporary facility for the evening. If this story touched you, please remember that every creature, no matter how small, deserves a fighting chance. And sometimes, in giving that chance to others, we find our own new beginnings. And as if in response, the smallest otter, soon to be released back to the wild, looked up at him one last time. A living reminder that even the most powerful floods eventually recede, leaving behind fertile ground for new life to flourish.